My first attempt at a big rig Model to RC conversion. Here's how it turned out and what I learned along the way. Hello everyone and welcome! Today I'm back with another custom RC build, this time something a bit bigger. Well, relatively speaking. I've built cars like this recently completed 85 Trans Am, light trucks like this 80 Dodge Ram Charger, but today I'm building a heavy-duty Class 8 truck in 1/25th scale, capable of some not-so-heavy hauling. Utilizing one of our newly designed CTC01 3D printable chassis and this plastic model kit from AMT, I'll be bringing this truck to life and showcasing the entire build process from printing to paint. While my knowledge of heavy-duty trucks is limited, and this was my first project utilizing this all-new RC platform, in the end I'm very satisfied with the results, and I certainly learned a lot throughout this project. I look forward to sharing my experience with all of you and hopefully providing any builders out there with some ideas and inspiration for their own projects. With the correct tools, materials, and a bit of patience, you can build yourself a great-looking functional scale model without breaking the bank. So without any further introductions, let's get this build started. The build began by designing and 3D printing a custom chassis to serve as the foundation of this functional RC model. I've covered this process in detail through a series of videos I've posted on this channel. I'll link to the playlist below in the description if you'd like to check it out. While I won't cover the design and assembly process in as much detail in this video, I do want to talk a bit about this chassis for those who might not be familiar with it. Named the CTC01, this RC chassis design is intended for converting larger commercial vehicles into fully functional RC models, much like I've done many times prior with cars. I wanted the chassis to be as easy to 3D print on a typical hobby-grade printer as possible and be relatively easy to put together. While scale accuracy and lifelike realism is always the goal with any model build, some compromises were made to simplify the chassis design and increase durability. One of the biggest compromises made was incorporating some common dual-shaft N20 motor and gear assemblies for use on the rear drive axles. While not the most lifelike drivetrain setup, this design is simpler, leaves plenty of room up front for a detailed engine bay, and the wheelbase can be infinitely adjusted as there's no drive shaft to worry about. In the end, I'm very satisfied with the chassis design so far, and I look forward to utilizing it for more projects in the future. Of course, be sure to stay tuned for updates and future videos featuring this platform. For anyone interested in building the same chassis that I have here, all of the STL files have been posted onto our Patreon, with the link being below in the description. A compatible hardware kit can also be found on our website. Overall, a pretty basic assembly process, which I've covered in detail in a prior video. I made sure to at least roughly match the length of the frame included in the plastic model kit, though of course the frame can be extended or shortened to be about any length that you might want. All of the parts that you see here were FDM 3D printed using a 0.4 size nozzle, and I'm utilizing the great looking Firestone tires that were included in the plastic model kit. Of course, as always, there was some trial and error involved, but eventually I was satisfied with the design and can move on to adding the body and electronics. I chose this 1/25th scale GMC General model kit from AMT to use for this project. The kit is packed with many parts, though clearly being an older design, some details and the overall fit and finish isn't the best, possibly making this kit a bit more of a challenge for a hobbyist with less experience. Shortcomings aside though, still tons of potential for a great build, just don't expect the pieces to fall into place like you can expect from some other model kits. The Coca-Cola livery that they display on the box art looks pretty nice, with a great variety of decals included, but I'll be choosing a paint job to represent a brand a little closer to home. While passenger cars come in many different sizes and configurations with regards to their chassis and drivetrains, large trucks like this tend to not have as much variation. Of course there are exceptions, but a pretty basic ladder frame chassis, big diesel engine up front, and one or more drive axles in the rear is pretty typical. They also all tend to be about the same width, which means that this chassis will be able to fit a wide variety of 1/24th and 1/25th scale models, with little work being needed to modify the chassis to fit correctly. When it came to modifying the model kit to fit the chassis, essentially no cutting or modifications needed to be made to get the cab and sleeper to fit, as just like on the real thing, it will be mounted just above the frame. Of course, at a certain point I needed to decide exactly how I wanted to mount the cab, but pretty quickly I chose to use magnets, as I've done with many projects prior. I designed and 3D printed these body mounts that you see here, along with some pieces to hold the RC electronics between the frame rails. Using magnets allows the cab to be easily removable if needed, allowing access to the electronics below. Speaking of electronics, there's plenty of room in this truck for them to be hidden. Unlike a smaller car build, where it can sometimes be a bit tricky to fit all of the electronics, and it's extra important to ensure you're using smaller size components, that's much less of a concern with this comparatively large truck. For example, the receiver I'm using is the stock 4-channel one that I took out of that 110 scale FMS FJ40. I don't need anything special with regards to the radio on this vehicle, so it'll work just fine. I cut a hole in the bottom of the sleeper so there's enough room for the top of the receiver. I also ran some wires inside so I can have a place to keep the battery. Obviously, plenty of room for this 3S LiPo. I could fit a much larger battery if I wanted to for some additional runtime. The roof of the sleeper snaps right into place, so this ended up being a great spot to store the battery. Even if the roof didn't snap into place though, using something like magnets or Velcro would work just fine. And again, more than enough room down below the cab for the 3S compatible ESC. I specifically chose 3S power, unlike the 1S and 2S LiPos I generally use for other projects, because I want to get as much power as I can out of these 12-volt drive motors. I don't intend to haul any serious loads with this truck. If you want to actually pull some weight, you'll need to step up to something like a 14th scale semi, which are incredible machines, but expect to shell out several thousand, not maybe a few hundred like is the case with what I'm building. While I'm really happy with these body mounts and the location of the receiver and ESC, this exact arrangement that I have here might not be ideal for your project, so unless you're building basically an identical truck to what I have here, expect some creativity to be required to get everything fitting and looking as best as possible. I'd love to build a cab-over style truck at some point, but I expect including a tilt cab and having a full engine on display might be difficult. Fortunately, having a fully detailed engine bay and interior on this truck will be no problem. The only thing to work around is the small steering servo up front. The mounts for the hood, which will allow it to pivot forward, get attached to the front bumper, which I'll be gluing into place later on after everything is painted. At this point, the chassis was built and tested, with the cab being able to be securely mounted. While condensed down into less than 10 minutes of this video, this was quite the journey, but at this point it's time to start working on some of the fun stuff, like putting together the interior. As I talked about in the last segment, with all of the electronics neatly tucked away below the cab, absolutely no modifications to the interior tub need to be made. I can put this interior together exactly as shown in the manual. Also, as I mentioned in the last segment, not all of these parts are the best fitting or best molded. Some work was required to clean up these parts and make sure everything fits together at least decently well, of course being that the interior is not going to be that visible on the finished truck. Going all out with detail is not really critical, but regardless, I put some effort into it and the results turned out looking great. After some sanding, trimming, cutting, and gluing, everything was ready for paint. I saw brown interiors in quite a few of the reference photos I found, so I decided to choose that color to paint this interior. It looks like these trucks came in a fairly wide variety of interior colors. I'm not sure if red, brown, and blue interiors like these are still optional on modern trucks, but on something from this era, I think it looks pretty cool. Just a quick blast with some cheap rattle cans. I actually like the look of it applied relatively light like you see here. When you look at the seats and the door panels, you can see some of the white plastic showing through. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like that sort of non-uniformity looks good for things like fabric or interior panels that maybe have a bit of wear or fading that's occurred. Of course, it's very plain in its current state, but after the paint had dried, I used a brush and some markers to add a bunch more detail and really start to make this interior look more authentic. Even though, just as you saw, everything was painted the same shade of brown, a black wash, made with some watered down acrylic paint, really helped to add a bit of variation, such as darkening the carpet. While I'm not going for a full-on patina look with this truck, I wasn't necessarily trying to make it look factory fresh either. And after doing my best to glue everything in place, despite not necessarily the best fitting parts, I think in the end it turned out looking great. No decals for the interior are provided, but a little work with some Sharpie markers helps bring it to life. A few little details such as the GMC emblem for the center of the steering wheel would have looked great, but we'll just say it fell off. Overall, a very nice looking result. As I've said before on prior projects, it's always nice when you can include a full interior on one of these custom RC builds, so I always enjoy being able to add any interior, especially one as detailed as this. With the interior completed, I continued by working on the body. Earlier, when I was doing some test fits on the chassis, I assembled the sleeper and installed the firewall. I also did some sanding and trimming in a few spots to remove any imperfections or mold lines that are present from the manufacturing process. After that, I glued the sleeper to the cab. As instructed in the manual, I drilled some holes on the roof of the cab to mount the lights and horns. I took some time to test fit any parts that will be glued to the body later on. I want to make sure I do this before painting all of these parts. From the headlights to the exhaust, there's a ton of individual parts that need to be assembled and made to fit. Again, I hate to beat a dead horse here, but not exactly the best fitting model kit ever produced. Even though I wasn't exactly striving for perfection, just to get the results that you'll see at the end took quite a bit of sanding, trimming, and refinement. This is the stage in a project though that you really want to take the time and get everything fitting well, as it'll result in a better looking model in the end. Even if it's not the best model kit ever, there's still tons of potential here if you take your time. Eventually, all of these parts for the body were ready for paint. I wanted to try some mild weathering on the cab, once again using some watered down black acrylic paint. This helped accentuate details like the panel lines, and just made the cab look a little bit dirty and grimy. I also used some Sharpie markers to once again add some details like the silver door handles. As I've said before, I'm no expert when it comes to adding these details, and it's not like I'm using a bunch of different powders and washes to add this effect, but this is the look that I was going for. Not full-on patina, but also not a pristine fresh off the dealer lot look. At this point, I did go ahead and install the interior, which was a very snug fit. So snug in fact that at some point a crack formed in the passenger side window, but it's in. Next, it was time to install all of the parts that get attached to the frame below the cab. Things like the fuel tanks, battery boxes, and steps. Once again, a lot of individual parts and pieces that need to be trimmed, sanded, and glued together. This is certainly not a kit where you want to throw out the manual before you're finished. I eventually had all of these parts put together and ready to be mounted to the frame. To try to make the chassis as serviceable and easy to disassemble as possible, I used magnets to secure most of these parts, allowing them to be easily removable. Seems to be about as good of a solution as anything else, so I did the same thing on the opposite side, and this chassis definitely looks a lot more scale with these additional items added. At this point, I went ahead and put together the hinges for the hood, just to make sure everything fits together and works as expected. I also figured out how far I wanted to mount the bumper from the chassis so the hood lines up with the cab. With all of that figured out, it was time for another round of painting. This included the wheels, chassis, and fenders. Once the paint was dry, or at least dry enough, I once again worked some magic with some paint pens, Sharpies, and some pastels to do some cheap weathering. Nothing complicated here, but a little paint and weathering certainly goes a long way to making this chassis look more like the real thing. Overall, I'm really happy with how this chassis is looking. Unlike before, at a glance, it's hard to tell this was even 3D printed. The detail work didn't stop with the chassis, of course. I continued by adding various parts included with the kit to the cab. From the firewall back, this thing is looking sweet, but there's certainly much more work that needs to be done up front. The build continued by assembling the engine. This Detroit diesel V8 is definitely a larger engine than what I'm used to building for models in this scale, but of course there'll be plenty of room under the hood to mount it. The engine detail is quite impressive, and it went together without any issues. I also put together the radiator and removed any parts that will be needed from the tree. Before test fitting the engine, I wanted to go ahead and get the front bumper and hood installed. I added a few details, such as doing a black wash on the grille and gluing a few small pieces to the bumper, before eventually gluing the entire hood bumper assembly onto the front of the frame, making sure that the hood was lined up as accurately as possible with the cab. It's really looking like a truck now, and that hood can pivot just like the real thing. Now it's time to squeeze in the engine. Some hacking was required, mostly around the transmission and the rear section of the engine, though a bit of material had to be removed from the front as well. After a bit of persuasion though, it's sitting between the frame rails exactly where it needs to be. I made any necessary modifications to the radiator so it will fit under the hood. Since the engine will be attached to the chassis, while I want the body to remain removable, I did have to modify this air intake by cutting it into two pieces, so part of it will come off with the body while the rest of it will remain with the engine. Not exactly ideal, but it's a small sacrifice to allow the body to remain removable. At this point, all of the under the hood parts had been modified to fit so I could get them all painted. I continued working on the truck while the paint was drying, starting with wiring up some functional LEDs. Not every light on this truck will be functional, just the headlights and high beams. As awesome as it would be to have everything functional, that would be quite the project, so I'm just going to keep things a little simpler for this truck. I used pico-sized LEDs with a warm glow, which I think will look perfect on an older truck like this. Of course, when soldering, I made sure to add a resistor, so when I power these LEDs with an 11 to 12 volt 3S LiPo, they won't burn out. On the opposite end of the lights, there's both a male and female JST RCY plug, so this wiring will go in between the battery and the ESC when installed in the truck. Like with some prior projects, I purchased these lights from Evan Designs, which has proved to be a great place to order small LEDs for builds like this. Before installing the lights, I noticed that I needed to add a few remaining details, including the turn signals and the hood ornament. This headlight design made installing functional LEDs quite easy. First, I drilled some holes into each light housing. After that, I glued the clear lenses in place and then secured the LEDs from the back. I suppose easy is relative here, as I'm not really a huge fan of messing around with these tiny LEDs, but with a bit of patience, everything was solidly secured into place, ready to be mounted to the truck. Both of the headlight housings were pushed through from the back side of the hood, making sure not to get the wires tangled up, and then they were glued into place from the front. To tidy up the wires, I glued them along the frame rails. As expected, those warm glow LEDs look great, not too bright, and they provide a very scale appearance. I was also able to tidy up those wires nicely so they're out of the way of any moving parts and the engine. At this point, the paint was dry, so I could get the engine assembled and installed. A little bit of fine-tuning in a few areas was required. No big deal though, as I could touch up any sections that had been cut away with a paint pen. Once again, I applied a black wash to add a bit of grime before gluing it to the chassis. After getting a few final details installed, like the radiator hoses and the steering box, this engine bay is looking pretty awesome. At this point, the truck was just about complete. I found these pieces included with the kit that I wanted to add to the rear of the chassis. I made any necessary modifications before getting them painted. I also cut a small piece of styrene to represent the deck plate. This piece serves to not only provide a place to stand while hooking up the lines to the trailer if this was a real truck, but in the case of this RC model, it helps hide the lack of a drive shaft. Finally, I wanted to add some taillights and reverse lights to the rear since none are present on this current chassis design. Using some real-life photos for reference, it seems a lot of trucks don't really have anything special with regards to the taillights, so I just printed a very simple rectangle with a few circles that I could paint to look like taillights and reverse lights. I will need to add a fifth wheel before I can attach any trailers, and I plan to add some wires to represent air lines that can get hooked up to the trailer, possibly serving as functional positive and negative wires so power can be sent to the trailer for lights. But I'll be showcasing those items in a future video where I build the trailer. For now though, I'm going to consider this GMC General finished. After many hours of work, the GMC General is finally complete. While this was certainly a learning experience, and of course there were a few minor hurdles along the way, overall a very fun and successful project. I'm pleased with the amount of scale detail I was able to add, including a full interior and engine bay. I also like the slightly dirty appearance that the truck has versus having flawless shiny paint. While I don't have anything to tow with the truck right now, it's going to have enough power to haul around the lightweight trailer plastic model kits like this one, which are going to look awesome behind this rig. Certainly stay tuned to see more on that. Of course it is a truck, not a race car, so top speed was not really a priority, but as you can see, it functions just as it should. There's decent enough low-down modulation with these motors, allowing the truck to drive pretty scale. The only thing that I don't really like is that due to the nature of the worm gears on these N20 motors, there's no coast, so to stop in a way that looks convincing, you have to slowly let off the throttle. Regardless though, a fun, affordable, and relatively simple project. Once again, if you're interested in learning more about the chassis used, or would like to build a similar truck yourself, definitely check out the links below in the description. Be sure to stay tuned for more build content like this coming soon. But that's going to be all for today's video. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.